Hello everyone, welcome to my GMB News channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The decision not to classify Axel Rudakubana as a terrorist following the Southport murders was right because it would be unhelpful to stretch the definition of terrorism to cover all extreme violence, the UK's terror watchdog has concluded. Jonathan Hall KC wrote that the legal definition of terrorism is already wide and should not be changed any further, in his post-Southport review of how extreme violence is legally classified. Expanding the definition would increase the possibility of inaccurate use and, in theory, abuse, he said. Hall concluded that while male loners accessing violent material online, desperate for notoriety, present a real threat, terrorism must only refer to violence committed to advance a political, religious, racial, or ideological cause, rather than serving as a label for the most serious offending. Hall said extending the definition of terrorism would have unintended consequences, such as hampering freedom of expression, for example, criminalizing those swapping war footage, and placing pressure on resources. Any family member whose loved one was murdered by a violent fantasist or psychopath would have reason to ask why counter-terrorism, policing, and MI5 were not monitoring the individual and preventing the attack, he said. The review was commissioned in January by the Home Secretary Yvette Cooper to examine terror legislation in light of modern threats we face. It followed a pledge by the Prime Minister Keir Starmer to update legislation to address the new threat Britain faces from extreme violence carried out by loners, misfits, young men in their bedrooms following the Southport murders. Hall said that instead police should learn lessons from counter-terrorism in how to manage the risk from individuals who plan to carry out extreme violence for its own sake or because of a personal grievance. This would include developing a bespoke policing response, informed by the understanding that counter-terrorism police have built in recent years of how to monitor dangerous lone actors and distinguish internet rhetoric and real-world attack planning, Hall said. This could pick up people such as Rudakubana, who was identified as a risk 3 times by the Prevent Counterterrorism program but then dropped due to a lack of evidence of any clear extremist ideology. Rudakubana was jailed for a minimum of 52 years for the murders of 3 girls and attempted murders of 8 other children and 2 adults at a Taylor Swift-themed dance class in Southport in July last year. His attack was not considered terrorism under existing laws. Hall felt that some counterterrorism investigative powers, such as the ability to hold a suspect for up to 14 days pre-charge, were not relevant to violent obsessives. However, he urged ministers to consider extending whole-life sentences to lone individuals who plan mass killings that are not motivated by terrorism. It is currently not an offense to prepare for a non-terror attack, unless so many steps are taken towards carrying it out that it becomes an attempt. This means that no prosecution would be available if the police raided an address and found careful handwritten but uncommunicated plans for carrying out a massacre, he wrote. It has become clear to me during the preparation of this report during January and February 2025 that there is a real and not theoretical gap for lone individuals who plan mass killing. If mass killing is intended, it is neither possible nor desirable to limit the offense to cases in which particularly extreme or terror-inducing forms of violence are intended. A government spokesperson said legislation would be amended to close the gaps identified in the report. Today's report is an important step in that search for answers, and to tackle horrific acts driven by a fixation on extreme violence, they said. They added that the government would look at the report's observation that social media was putting long-established principles around how we communicate after an attack like this under strain, and the challenge of tackling misinformation. A public inquiry into the Southport tragedy would be set up soon, the spokesperson said. The decision not to classify Axel Rudakubana as a terrorist following the Southport murders was a complex but ultimately correct one. The UK's independent reviewer of terrorism legislation Jonathan Hall KC has concluded in his post-Southport review that the existing legal definition of terrorism is sufficiently broad and should not be expanded further. His reasoning underscores the importance of maintaining legal precision and avoiding the pitfalls of overclassification. Hall's review emerged in response to growing concerns over acts of extreme violence committed by so-called lone actors, individuals who operate outside traditional terrorist organizations but nonetheless pose a serious threat to public safety. The Southport murders, in which Rudakubana carried out a devastating attack, raise difficult questions about whether such acts should fall under the banner of terrorism. However, Hall's careful legal analysis suggests that broadening the definition of terrorism to include all forms of extreme violence would not serve the interests of justice, law enforcement, or public safety. One of Hall's central arguments is that the current legal definition of terrorism already provides law enforcement with extensive powers. Terrorism is defined in the UK as violence committed to advance a political, religious, racial, or ideological cause. While Rutabagan's attack was horrific, there was no evidence to suggest that he was motivated by any of these factors. Instead, it appeared to be an act driven by personal grievance or psychological distress. Expanding the legal definition to include such acts would risk conflating different types of violence, leading to potential misuse and legal uncertainty. There is also a risk of mission creep, where counterterrorism resources are stretched thin by being applied too broadly. Counterterrorism policing and intelligence agencies like MI5 have limited resources, and their primary focus must remain on preventing politically or ideologically motivated attacks. If every instance of extreme violence were treated as terrorism, counterterrorism agencies could become overwhelmed, diminishing their ability to track and prevent actual terrorist threats. Additionally, Hall warns of potential unintended consequences, particularly concerning freedom of expression. A broader definition of terrorism could criminalize activities such as sharing war footage, discussing violent events online, or engaging in certain types of research. These restrictions could have chilling effects on journalism, academia, and even casual online discourse. Furthermore, if extreme violence driven by personal grievance were categorized as terrorism, it could lead to increased surveillance and potential criminalization of individuals who exhibit disturbing but non-terroristic behavior. Despite these concerns, the government has recognized the growing threat posed by individuals who engage in extreme violence without traditional ideological motives. In response, Prime Minister Keir Starmer has pledged to update legislation to address extreme violence carried out by loners, misfits, young men in their bedrooms. This reflects an acknowledgement that while such individuals may not fit the traditional terrorist mold, they still pose significant dangers that need to be addressed. The challenge, then, is to develop effective legal and policing strategies to manage the risk posed by these individuals without unnecessarily broadening terrorism laws. Hall suggests that law enforcement should draw lessons from counterterrorism strategies in managing these threats. This could involve improved monitoring of individuals who show warning signs of violent behavior, greater collaboration between mental health professionals and law enforcement, and better risk assessment tools to identify potential attackers before they act. Hall also highlights the importance of ensuring that existing legal frameworks for dealing with extreme violence are robust and adequately enforced. The UK already has a range of criminal laws that can be used to prosecute individuals who commit acts of mass violence, including murder, conspiracy to commit violence, and firearms offences. Enhancing the capabilities of police and security services to detect and prevent such crimes without resorting to terrorism legislation is a more effective approach. One area of focus should be the online radicalization of violent individuals. While Rutabaga was not classified as a terrorist, his actions may have been influenced by exposure to violent content online. There is growing recognition that certain online spaces serve as breeding grounds for extremism, not necessarily of a political or ideological nature, but rather centered on nihilistic or personal grievances. Tackling this issue requires a combination of regulation, content moderation by tech companies, and education on the dangers of online radicalization. Another consideration is how to support communities and families in identifying and reporting concerning behaviors. Many individuals who go on to commit acts of extreme violence exhibit warning signs beforehand, yet these signs are often missed or ignored. Providing training and resources to help people recognize and respond to these signs could play a key role in prevention. The case of Axel Rutabaga and the Southport murders illustrates the evolving nature of violent threats facing modern societies. While terrorism remains a critical concern, it is only one aspect of a broader landscape of extreme violence. Ensuring that legal definitions remain clear and appropriately targeted is essential for effective law enforcement and justice. As Hall concludes, maintaining a focused definition of terrorism helps prevent misapplication of counterterrorism resources while still allowing for strong legal responses to other forms of violence. Ultimately, the government must balance the need for security with the protection of civil liberties and legal clarity. The decision not to classify Rudakubana as a terrorist was not about downplaying the severity of his crimes, but about ensuring that the legal framework for addressing violence remains both effective and fair. As new threats emerge, policymakers must continue to adapt, drawing on lessons from counterterrorism while preserving the fundamental principles of justice and due process. So what do you guys think about this update? Let me know in the comments below. And if you like my videos, please press like and subscribe for more. I'll see you guys next time.